Harold Shipman case, Dr. Death inside the mind of a man who swore to cure and decided to kill. Introduction. In the quiet streets of Hyde, Greater Manchester, where elderly residents trusted their family doctor with their lives, Harold Frederick Shipman moved like a shadow between life and death. For over 2 decades, this seemingly caring physician held the power to heal in one hand and the instruments of death in the other. Known to his patients as Dr. Ship, he embodied the very essence of medical dedication, visiting homes at all hours, showing genuine concern for the elderly and maintaining an impeccable reputation that would shield him from suspicion for years. The Shipman case would later be recognized as one of the most prolific serial killing sprees in modern history, with conservative estimates placing his victim count at 218 confirmed murders, though investigators believe the true number could exceed 250. What makes this case particularly chilling is not just the scale of the crimes, but the calculated precision with which they were carried out by a man who had sworn the Hippocratic Oath to first do no harm. Born in 1946 in Nottingham, Shipman's story reads like a medical thriller that Hollywood would struggle to make believable. His crimes spanned from 1975 to 1998, a period during which he systematically murdered patients using lethal injections of diamorphine, often while their families waited in adjacent rooms. The very trust that patients placed in their doctor became the weapon he wielded most effectively. This case has inspired numerous documentaries, books, and television adaptations, including the acclaimed series The Investigation, and multiple BBC documentaries that attempted to unravel the psychology behind Britain's most notorious medical murderer. Each adaptation struggles with the same haunting question: how does a healer become a killer, and how did he evade detection for so long? If you're drawn to stories that explore the darkest corners of human psychology, make sure to follow this channel, because the journey into Harold Shipman's mind has only just begun. The origins. Harold Frederick Shipman entered the world on January 14, 1946. In Nottingham, England, born to Harold and Vera Shipman in a working-class household that would shape his early understanding of power, control, and the fragility of human life. His father worked as a lorry driver, while his mother Vera became the dominant force in young Harold's life, a woman whose influence would prove both formative and, perhaps, fatally significant. The Shipman household was one where academic achievement was not just encouraged, but demanded. Vera Shipman harbored ambitious dreams for her son, viewing education as the pathway out of their modest circumstances. She instilled in Harold a sense of superiority, repeatedly telling him he was special, different from other children, destined for greatness. This constant reinforcement of his exceptional nature would later manifest in his godlike complex over life and death. Harold excelled academically, displaying the methodical precision that would later characterize both his medical practice and his murders. He was a quiet, studious child who preferred books to playground games, often spending hours alone, developing the introspective nature that would make him difficult to read as an adult. Teachers described him as intelligent but distant, capable of forming superficial relationships, but never truly connecting with peers. The most pivotal moment in young Harold's psychological development came when his mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. He was just 17 years old when he began witnessing Vera's gradual deterioration. But more significantly, he observed the power that morphine held over her suffering. Day after day, he watched as injections of the powerful painkiller transformed his mother from a woman writhing in agony to someone peaceful, almost euphoric. During Vera's final months, Harold became her primary caregiver, administering her morphine injections under medical supervision. He later described these moments as transformative, watching the immediate relief wash over her face as the drug took effect. In these intimate moments of administering what he saw as mercy, the seeds of his future methodology were planted. The power to end suffering, to control the moment between pain and peace became intoxicating. When Vera died in 1963, Harold's grief was profound but complicated. He had not only lost his mother, but also his first taste of the ultimate power, the ability to ease someone's transition from life to death. This experience would haunt and drive him for the rest of his life, creating a psychological template that merged care with control, healing with harm. The young man who emerged from this experience was forever changed, carrying within him a dangerous understanding of morphine's power and a growing belief in his own authority over life and death. As he prepared to enter medical school, Harold Shipman was no longer just a grieving son. He was someone who had glimpsed the ultimate power and found it irresistible. The first signs herald Shipman's entry into Leeds School of Medicine in 1965 marked the beginning of his transformation, from a promising student into something far more sinister. His fellow medical students remember him as competent but oddly detached, displaying an unusual fascination with the pharmacological effects of opiates that went beyond academic curiosity. While other students struggled with the emotional weight of their first encounters with death, Shipman seemed unnaturally comfortable, even energized by these experiences. During his clinical rotations, supervisors noted his exceptional bedside manner with elderly patients, who seemed to gravitate toward his calm, authoritative presence. However, some colleagues observed troubling patterns in his behavior. He would often volunteer for night shifts and weekend duties, particularly in wards housing terminally ill patients. When questioned about his dedication, Shipman would simply state that he felt called to ease suffering, a noble sentiment that masked darker motivations. His first documented brush with drug abuse occurred during his final year of medical school. Shipman began experimenting with pethidine, a powerful painkiller similar to morphine, initially claiming it was for research purposes. The drug provided him with the same sense of control and euphoria he had witnessed in his mother's final days. But now he was both the administrator and the recipient of its effects. After graduating in 1970 and completing his internship, Shipman married Primrose May Oxtoby, a quiet woman who would remain devoted to him throughout his career, despite growing evidence of his peculiarities. Their marriage seemed to provide him with the perfect cover of respectability, a family man dedicated to his profession and community. In 1974, Shipman joined the Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in Todmorden, West Yorkshire, as a junior partner. It was here that his colleagues first noticed his unusual relationship with controlled substances. Pharmacy records showed discrepancies in his pethidine orders, with Shipman consistently requesting amounts far exceeding what his patient load would require. When confronted, he claimed the extra drugs were for emergency house calls and terminal care cases. The first official investigation into Shipman's drug use began in 1975, when a routine audit revealed he had been forging prescriptions and stockpiling pethidine for personal use. Rather than face criminal charges, he agreed to enter a drug rehabilitation program and pay a substantial fine. His medical colleagues, believing this was an isolated incident of addiction rather than something more sinister, supported his rehabilitation and eventual return to practice. What they didn't realize was that Shipman's drug abuse was not the disease, it was merely a symptom of his growing obsession with the power over life and death that opiates represented. During his rehabilitation, he didn't overcome his addiction. He simply learned to be more careful, more methodical in his approach to obtaining and using controlled substances. By 1977, Shipman had successfully completed his rehabilitation and was seeking a new position, armed with glowing references from colleagues who believed in his recovery. He had learned valuable lessons during this period, not about the dangers of drug abuse, but about the importance of maintaining appearances and avoiding detection. The stage was now set for him to begin the most prolific killing spree in British criminal history. The crime. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman made what would be his final house call as a practicing physician. Kathleen Grundy, a vibrant 81-year-old former mayoress of Hyde, had contacted his surgery complaining of feeling unwell. By all accounts, Mrs. Grundy was in remarkable health for her age, active in community affairs, sharp-minded, and living independently. She had no reason to suspect that her trusted family doctor was about to become her executioner. Shipman arrived at Mrs. Grundy's home on Joel Lane at approximately 12:30 p.m., carrying his medical bag with its carefully concealed vial of diamorphine. The same drug that had eased his mother's suffering decades earlier had become his weapon of choice. Refined through years of practice on unsuspecting victims, Mrs. Grundy welcomed him warmly, as she had done countless times before. Trusting in the man who had cared for her and her neighbors for over 2 decades, the injection was swift and clinical. Shipman told Mrs. Grundy it was a vitamin boost, something to help her feel better. Within minutes, the diamorphine coursed through her system, initially providing a sense of euphoria before rapidly depressing her respiratory system. Shipman watched with the same detached fascination he had developed over the years, timing the progression from consciousness to unconsciousness to death with scientific precision. Mrs. Grundy died alone with her killer, who then carefully staged the scene to suggest natural death. He positioned her body in a chair, arranged her clothing, and prepared his story for the inevitable questions. When neighbors found her body later that afternoon, Shipman was called to certify the death, playing the role of the concerned physician who had done everything possible to help his patient. But Kathleen Grundy's murder differed from Shipman's previous crimes in one crucial aspect. She had recently changed her will, leaving her substantial estate to Harold Shipman rather than her family. This deviation from his usual pattern of selecting victims with modest means would prove to be his downfall. Mrs. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a solicitor who immediately recognized the suspicious nature of the will and the circumstances surrounding her mother's sudden death. The forged will was crudely executed, typed on an old typewriter and witnessed by 2 of Shipman's patients who later claimed no memory of signing the document. More damning still, the will was dated just months before Mrs. Grundy's death and left her entire $386,000 estate to the doctor who had supposedly tried to save her life. What investigators would later discover was that Mrs. Grundy's murder was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a killing spree that had lasted over 2 decades. Shipman had perfected his method through practice on hundreds of victims, always choosing elderly patients who lived alone, always using diamorphine to ensure a peaceful death that would raise no immediate suspicions. The autopsy on Mrs. Grundy's exhumed body revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in her system, levels so high that death would have been virtually instantaneous. This discovery opened the floodgates to one of the largest murder investigations in British history. As detectives began to examine every death certificate Shipman had signed during his career, as news of the investigation spread through Hyde and beyond, a community that had trusted and revered their family, Doctor began to confront the horrifying possibility that the man they had welcomed into their homes had been systematically murdering their loved ones. The crime that would finally expose Harold Shipman had been his most brazen and, ultimately, his most foolish. The reaction. The news that Harold Shipman was under investigation for murder sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Hyde, where residents struggled to reconcile the caring doctor they knew with the monster investigators were describing. For over 20 years, Shipman had been more than just a physician to his patients. He had been a confidant, a source of comfort in their final years, and a trusted presence in their homes during their most vulnerable moments. Margaret Walker, whose 81-year-old mother had died under Shipman's care just months earlier, spoke for many when she told reporters, "He was such a lovely man, so caring and gentle. He would come at any hour, day or night, if we needed him. I can't believe this is true, her words echoed throughout the community as families began the agonizing process of questioning whether their loved ones had died, natural deaths, or had been murdered by the man they had trusted most. The local media coverage was initially cautious, with journalists struggling to verify the scope of the allegations against such a respected figure. However, as more details emerged about the investigation and the exhumation of bodies began, the story exploded into national headlines. The British press, known for their sensational coverage of criminal cases, found themselves dealing with a story so extraordinary that even their most dramatic headlines seemed inadequate. If this story has captured your attention, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who are fascinated by true crime, because the investigation that followed would reveal horrors beyond anyone's imagination. The psychological impact on Shipman's surviving patients was devastating. Many elderly residents who had been under his care for years suddenly found themselves questioning every interaction they had ever had with him. Support groups formed spontaneously as people shared their fears and memories, trying to process the possibility that they had unknowingly been potential victims of a serial killer. The medical community's reaction was equally profound. The General Medical Council launched an immediate investigation into how Shipman had been able to operate undetected for so long, while his former colleagues at the Donnybrook Medical Center struggled with guilt and disbelief. Dr. Linda Reynolds, who had worked alongside Shipman for years, later admitted, "We saw him as dedicated, perhaps overly so. He would take on the difficult cases, the dying patients that others found emotionally draining. We thought it was compassion." The investigation scope became clear when police announced they would be examining every death certificate Shipman had signed during his career, potentially thousands of cases spanning over 2 decades. The logistical challenge was enormous, requiring the coordination of multiple police forces, forensic experts, and medical professionals to determine which deaths warranted further investigation. Families across Greater Manchester began coming forward with their own suspicions about relatives who had died under Shipman's care. The police established a special hotline that was flooded with calls from people who had previously accepted their loved ones' deaths as natural but now harbored doubts. Each call represented not just a potential crime scene but a family's worst fears being realized. The media attention intensified when it was revealed that concerns about Shipman's high death rate had been raised as early as 1998 by Dr. Linda Reynolds. But no formal investigation had been launched at that time. This revelation sparked outrage about systemic failures in medical oversight and raised questions about how many lives might have been saved if earlier warnings had been heeded. As the investigation expanded, the true scale of Shipman's crimes began to emerge, transforming a local tragedy into a national scandal that would forever change how Britain viewed medical accountability and patient safety. The investigation, Detective Chief Inspector Mike Williams of Greater Manchester Police found himself leading what would become one of the most complex murder investigations in British history. The challenge was unprecedented. How do you investigate potential murders when the victims have been buried for years? The crime scenes have been cleaned, and the only witness to most of the deaths was the suspected killer himself. The investigation began with the systematic examination of Shipman's patient records, a task that required teams of detectives, medical experts, and forensic accountants working around the clock. What they discovered was a pattern of death that defied statistical probability. In areas where Shipman practiced, the death rate among elderly patients was significantly higher than the national average, with most deaths occurring during afternoon house calls when Shipman was alone with his victims. The exhumation process began in October 1998, starting with Kathleen Grundy and expanding to include dozens of other suspected victims. Each exhumation was a delicate operation, requiring careful coordination between police, forensic pathologists, and grieving families who had to relive their loss while confronting the possibility that their loved ones had been murdered. The presence of diamorphine in tissue samples that should have contained no trace of the drug provided damning evidence of Shipman's methodology. Dr. John Grenville, the forensic pathologist leading the post-mortem examinations, later described the investigation as unlike anything I had encountered in 30 years of practice. The preservation of diamorphine in muscle tissue allowed investigators to determine not only that the victims had been murdered, but also to estimate the dosages used. In every case, the levels were far beyond therapeutic doses, indicating a clear intent to kill rather than to treat. The investigation team developed a sophisticated database to track Shipman's movements, patient visits, and death certificates. They discovered that he had been remarkably methodical in his approach, often visiting victims multiple times before administering the fatal injection, establishing a pattern of deteriorating health that would make their eventual death seem natural. His medical notes, while appearing thorough, often contained subtle fabrications designed to support his death certificates. One of the most chilling discoveries was Shipman's stockpiling of diamorphine. Pharmacy records revealed that he had been ordering quantities of the drug far exceeding what his legitimate patient load would require. When questioned about these discrepancies during earlier audits, he had always provided plausible explanations about treating terminal patients and maintaining emergency supplies for house calls. The psychological profile developed by criminal psychologists painted a picture of a man who had become addicted not just to drugs, but to the power over life and death. Dr. Richard Badcock, a forensic psychiatrist involved in the case, noted that Shipman's victims were almost exclusively elderly, women living alone, vulnerable, individuals who trusted him completely and whose deaths would be least likely to raise suspicions. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered evidence of Shipman's careful selection process. He would often target patients who had no close family members or whose relatives lived far away, minimizing the likelihood of detailed questioning about their deaths. His timing was equally calculated, usually making fatal house calls during afternoon hours when neighbors were less likely to be present, and when his absence from the surgery would not be immediately noticed. The breakthrough in understanding Shipman's methodology came when investigators analyzed his computer records and discovered that he had been retroactively altering patient files after their deaths, adding symptoms and conditions that would support his death certificates. This digital trail provided irrefutable evidence of premeditation and systematic deception spanning years. The investigation ultimately examined over 3,000 deaths associated with Shipman's practice, a massive undertaking that required the coordination of multiple police forces and medical experts. The evidence they compiled would form the foundation of one of the most significant criminal trials in British legal history. But the psychological impact of uncovering such systematic betrayal of trust would resonate far beyond the courtroom. The judgment. The trial of Harold Frederick Shipman began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court, presided over by Mr. Justice Forbes. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and family members of the victims, all seeking answers to the question that had haunted the community for months. How could a trusted doctor become Britain's most prolific serial killer? Shipman entered the dock appearing every inch the respectable physician he had pretended to be for decades. Dressed in a conservative suit, with his characteristic beard neatly trimmed, he maintained an air of dignified indignation throughout the proceedings. His defense team, led by Nicola Davies QC, faced an almost impossible task, defending a man against overwhelming forensic evidence while maintaining his innocence in the face of testimony from dozens of grieving families. The prosecution led by Richard Henriquez QC, methodically presented their case over 6 months, detailing 15 specific murder charges and 1 count of forgery related to Kathleen Grundy's will. Each case was presented with clinical precision, showing the jury how Shipman had systematically betrayed the trust of his most vulnerable patients. The evidence was devastating. Diamorphine found in exhumed bodies, forged medical records, and a pattern of deaths that defied medical explanation. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Angela Woodruff, Kathleen Grundy's daughter, testified about her mother's final days. Her voice breaking with emotion, she described how her vibrant, independent mother had suddenly died after a routine visit from Dr. Shipman, and how the forged will had immediately raised her suspicions. "My mother trusted him completely," she told the court. "She would never have believed that the man she welcomed into her home was planning to kill her." The defense strategy centered on portraying Shipman as a dedicated physician who had been unfairly targeted by a flawed investigation. They argued that the deaths were natural, that the presence of diamorphine could be explained by legitimate medical treatment, and that the prosecution had cherry-picked cases to build a false pattern. However, their arguments crumbled under the weight of forensic evidence and expert testimony. Dr. John Grenville's forensic testimony was particularly damaging to the defense. He explained to the jury how the levels of diamorphine found in the victims' bodies were far beyond therapeutic doses, and how the drug's presence in muscle tissue proved it had been administered shortly before death. His calm, scientific presentation of the evidence left little room for doubt about the cause of death in each case. The trial also revealed the psychological profile that investigators had developed of Shipman. Expert witnesses described how his childhood experiences with his mother's morphine treatment had shaped his understanding of the drug's power, and how his position as a trusted physician had provided him with the perfect cover for his crimes. The jury heard how he had selected his victims carefully, targeting elderly patients who lived alone and whose deaths would be least likely to raise suspicions. Throughout the trial, Shipman maintained his innocence with an arrogance that shocked observers. He rarely showed emotion, even when confronted with evidence of his victims' final moments. His demeanor suggested a man who believed himself superior to the legal system, someone who had played God for so long that he couldn't accept being judged by mere mortals. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning their verdict on January 31st, 2000, as the foreman stood to deliver the verdicts. The courtroom fell silent. Guilty rang out 15 times, once for each murder charge, followed by guilty on the forgery count. Shipman showed no visible reaction to the verdicts, maintaining the same cold detachment he had displayed throughout the trial. Mr. Justice Forbes, in passing sentence, described Shipman's crimes as wicked and beyond comprehension. He sentenced him to life imprisonment on each murder count, with the recommendation that he never be released. "You have betrayed the trust of your patients," the judge told him. "You have brought dishonor to a noble profession. You will spend the remainder of your days in prison." As Shipman was led away to begin his life sentence, the families of his victims finally had their answers, but the healing process would take much longer than the trial itself. Prison and Reflection, HMP. Frankland, a maximum security prison in County Durham, became Harold Shipman's final address when he was transferred there in March 2000 to begin serving his life sentence. The man who had once held the power of life and death over hundreds of patients now found himself subject to the rigid routines and constant surveillance of the British prison system. For someone who had spent decades controlling every aspect of his professional environment, the loss of autonomy was a profound psychological shock. Prison staff described Shipman as a model prisoner who adapted quickly to institutional life, perhaps finding comfort in its structured routine. He was housed in the hospital wing for his own protection, as his crimes had made him a target for other inmates who viewed his betrayal of vulnerable elderly people as particularly heinous. Despite this isolation, Shipman maintained his innocence and showed no remorse for his actions, continuing to present himself as a victim of a flawed justice system. His daily routine was monotonous: breakfast at 7:30 a.m., followed by periods of association with other prisoners, educational activities, and work assignments. Shipman initially worked in the prison library, where his medical knowledge and articulate manner made him popular with both staff and inmates, seeking advice about health issues. However, prison authorities eventually moved him to other duties when they realized he was still attempting to practice medicine informally, unable to abandon his role as a physician, even in captivity. The psychological evaluations conducted during his imprisonment revealed a man struggling with the collapse of his carefully constructed identity. For over 30 years, Shipman had defined himself as a healer, a pillar of his community, and a man whose medical expertise made him indispensable. The revelation of his true nature and his subsequent imprisonment had shattered this self-image, leaving him to confront the reality of what he had become. Dr. Alan Adshead, a forensic psychiatrist who interviewed Shipman multiple times during his imprisonment, noted his subject's complete inability to acknowledge the suffering he had caused. He spoke about his victims as if they were medical cases rather than human beings. Dr. Adshead later wrote, "There was no emotional connection to the pain he had inflicted on families, no recognition of the trust he had betrayed. It was as if he existed in a moral vacuum." Shipman's correspondence with the outside world was limited and carefully monitored. His wife Primrose remained loyal, visiting regularly and maintaining her belief in his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence presented at trial. Their conversations, recorded by prison authorities, revealed a man who had convinced himself that he was the victim of a conspiracy by medical authorities and police investigators who had never understood his dedication to patient care. The isolation of prison life seemed to intensify Shipman's narcissistic tendencies. He spent hours writing detailed complaints about his treatment, legal appeals that had no basis in law, and elaborate theories about how the evidence against him had been fabricated. His writings revealed a mind that had completely detached from reality, unable to accept responsibility for actions that had destroyed hundreds of lives. Subscribe to this channel if you want to explore more cases that delve into the psychology of killers, because understanding the mind behind the crime is often more disturbing than the crime itself. As the months turned to years, Shipman's behavior became increasingly erratic. He alternated between periods of apparent calm and episodes of rage directed at prison staff, fellow inmates, and the legal system that had convicted him. His medical knowledge, once used to heal and later to kill, now served only to diagnose his own declining mental state as he struggled to maintain his sanity in an environment where his former status meant nothing. The man who had once been trusted with the lives of thousands now faced the prospect of spending his remaining years in a cell, stripped of the power and respect that had defined his existence for so long. The mind of the criminal. The psychological profile of Harold Shipman presents one of the most complex and disturbing cases in the annals of criminal psychology. Unlike typical serial killers who are driven by sexual gratification, rage, or obvious psychopathic tendencies, Shipman operated from a unique psychological framework that combined genuine medical knowledge with a pathological need for control over life and death. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a renowned forensic psychiatrist who studied the case extensively, identified several key psychological factors that contributed to Shipman's transformation from healer to killer. The most significant was his childhood experience. watching his mother's morphine treatment, which created what she termed a death imprint, a psychological template that associated the administration of opiates with both power and mercy. This early exposure to the drug's effects established a neural pathway that would later be triggered by his medical training and access to controlled substances. The concept of medical narcissism plays a crucial role in understanding Shipman's psychology. Throughout his career, he cultivated an image of himself as an exceptionally dedicated physician, someone whose commitment to patient care exceeded that of his colleagues. This self-perception was reinforced by the genuine gratitude of patients and families who appreciated his willingness to make house calls and provide personal attention. However, this positive feedback gradually evolved into a God complex, where Shipman began to believe he had the right to determine who lived and who died. Psychological evaluations revealed that Shipman exhibited traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, including an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for constant admiration, and a complete lack of empathy for his victims. His selection of elderly, vulnerable patients was not random, but reflected a calculated choice to target individuals who would be least likely to resist or question his authority. The power dynamic between doctor and patient provided him with the perfect cover for his crimes. The role of addiction in Shipman's psychology cannot be understated. His early experimentation with pethidine during medical school evolved into a complex relationship with opiates that went beyond simple substance abuse. Forensic psychologists believe that Shipman became addicted not just to the drugs themselves, but to the ritual of administration and the power it represented. Each injection became a moment of ultimate control, where he held complete authority over another person's existence. Dr. Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised PCLR assessment of Shipman revealed scores consistent with psychopathic personality. Traits particularly in areas of emotional detachment, manipulation, and lack of remorse. However, Shipman's case was unusual because his psychopathy was masked by genuine professional competence and an ability to form superficial relationships with patients and colleagues. This successful psychopath profile allowed him to operate undetected for decades. The temporal progression of Shipman's crimes suggests a gradual escalation that began with mercy killings of genuinely suffering patients and evolved into the systematic murder of healthy individuals. This progression indicates a psychological deterioration where the initial rationalization of ending suffering became a cover for increasingly arbitrary decisions about who deserved to live. The murders became a form of psychological addiction, providing him with a sense of power and control that he could not achieve through legitimate medical practice. Neurological studies of similar cases suggest that Shipman may have suffered from abnormalities in brain regions associated with empathy and moral reasoning. The combination of childhood trauma, substance abuse, and possible neurological dysfunction created a perfect storm of psychological factors that transformed a promising medical student into Britain's most prolific serial killer. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Shipman derived genuine satisfaction from his crimes. Witness accounts describe him as being unusually calm and even cheerful after visits where patients died, suggesting that the murders provided him with a form of psychological release that he could not obtain through normal human interaction. The case of Harold Shipman demonstrates how the very qualities that make someone an effective physician, attention to detail, calm under pressure, and the ability to make life and death decisions, can become weapons in the hands of someone with a fundamentally disordered psychology. Mysterious and reflective conclusion. On January 13, 2004, at 6:20 a.m., Harold Frederick Shipman was found hanging in his cell at HMP Wakefield, having fashioned a noose from bedsheets and torn clothing. The man who had controlled the deaths of hundreds of others had finally chosen the timing of his own demise, denying the families of his victims any possibility of further answers and taking with him secrets that would never be revealed. His suicide note, brief and characteristically self-serving, made no mention of his victims or their families. Instead, it focused on his concern for his wife's financial security, as his death would allow her to claim his pension benefits that would have been forfeited if he had died while serving his sentence. Even in death, Shipman demonstrated the same calculating nature that had characterized his crimes, manipulating circumstances to serve his own purposes one final time. The timing of his suicide was particularly significant. It occurred on the day before his 58th birthday, suggesting a final act of control over his own narrative. For a man who had spent decades determining when others would die, the ability to choose his own moment of death represented the ultimate expression of the power that had driven him throughout his criminal career. The investigation into Shipman's crimes continued long after his death, with the Shipman inquiry ultimately concluding that he had killed at least 218 patients, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. However, investigators believe the true number may be significantly higher, with some estimates suggesting he may have been responsible for over 250 deaths during his career. The psychological questions surrounding Shipman's case remain as compelling today as they were during his trial. How does a person sworn to preserve life become so comfortable with taking it? What transforms the healing instinct into a killing compulsion? The answers lie somewhere in the complex intersection of childhood trauma, professional opportunity, and a fundamentally disordered mind that viewed human life as something to be controlled rather than cherished. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Shipman case is how it forces us to confront the vulnerability inherent in the doctor-patient relationship. Every day, millions of people place their complete trust in medical professionals, believing that the white coat and stethoscope represent healing and hope. Shipman's crimes shattered that fundamental trust, revealing how easily the symbols of healing can become instruments of harm when wielded by someone with malevolent intent. The legacy of Harold Shipman extends far beyond his individual crimes. His case led to fundamental changes in medical practice, including stricter controls on controlled substances, mandatory second opinions for death certificates, and enhanced oversight of physicians working in isolation. These reforms represent society's attempt to prevent another Shipman, but they also serve as a permanent reminder of how one man's evil can corrupt an entire profession's reputation. In the end, Harold Shipman remains an enigma wrapped in the mundane facade of a family doctor. He was neither the obvious monster that popular culture often portrays serial killers to be, nor the dedicated physician that his patients believed him to be. He was something far more disturbing, a reminder that evil can wear the most trusted faces, and that the capacity for systematic cruelty can lurk behind the most respectable facades. The question that haunts those who study his case is not just how he killed so many, but how he lived with himself while doing it. The answer may lie in the possibility that for Harold Shipman, the act of killing had become so normalized, so integrated into his sense of professional purpose, that he genuinely believed he was providing a service. In his twisted worldview, he was not a murderer, but a merciful God, granting peaceful deaths to those he deemed ready to die. This delusion, perhaps more than any other aspect of his psychology, reveals the true horror of the Shipman case. It suggests that the greatest monsters are not those who know they are evil, but those who have convinced themselves they are good while committing unspeakable acts. In this light, Harold Shipman becomes not just a serial killer, but a cautionary tale about the human capacity for self-deception and the dangerous power of unchecked authority. The families of his victims continue to live with questions that will never be answered, wounds that will never fully heal, and the knowledge that their loved ones' final moments were spent in the presence of someone who viewed their deaths not as tragedies to be prevented, but as opportunities to exercise ultimate control. If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to this channel to explore other real crimes that shocked the world and the minds behind them.